In an earlier video, I have categorically explained last 2000 years of history of population control. And I have also discussed something called eugenics, which essentially talks about cultivation of a human race or noble human race of noble bloodline. I have categorically stated the roles played by different entities in this regard, but in this particular video, I am going to concentrate only on the Rockefeller family and the role they played in the population control and the eugenics program before the Second World War and after the Second World War. Some of the things I have already discussed before, but you should watch this video till the very end to understand the role played by the Rockefeller family in particular before and after the Second World War. Kindly watch this video till the end. Welcome to a new episode of Alternative Perspective. Ruling elites of the world and their clique is driven by a sick mentality of racial supremacism. This sick mentality is at the heart of racism, casteism, white supremacism, fascism, untouchability, and countless number of wars. This sick mentality is at the heart of British and American imperialism. They consider people of developing nations such as India, China, Brazil as the useless eaters or unwanted beings or cancers or imbeciles for that matter. This sick mentality culminated into a field of study called eugenics, a pseudoscience. Eugenics talks about the creation of a master human race of noble birth, that is of noble bloodline. One of the biggest proponents of this eugenics idea is the Rockefeller family, who belong to the ruling elites. John D. Rockefeller Sr. founded the Standard Oil Company. He then founded the Rockefeller Foundation, which started to heavily fund the eugenics program in Europe and USA leading up to the Second World War. They funded American Eugenics Society, Planned Parenthood program by Margaret Sanger, Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany, or Cold Spring Harbor for that matter in United States of America. They rejected the idea that all humans are born equal and started to propagate the idea of cultivating a master human race of noble birth, that is of noble bloodline. During World War II, Nazis committed genocide of massive proportion. Nazis slaughtered Roma people of Indian origin. Nazis slaughtered Slavic people, that is Slavs, who are the native people of Russia and Eastern Europe, and African Asians living in Europe. Ernst Rudin, a Nazi German eugenist and psychiatrist from Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, drafted the forced sterilization law and was instrumental behind the forced sterilization and clinical killing of children and adults. Ernst Rudin and Kaiser Wilhelm Institute was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Nazi eugenics program was helped by IBM, that is International Business Machine from USA, under the direction of former president of IBM, Thomas Jefferson Sr. Leading up to the World War II, with funding from Rockefeller Foundation, population control agenda and eugenics program went unabated in the United States of America. Through the involvement of Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood and, for that matter, American Eugenics Society. Sterilization initiatives and euthanasia programs were conducted in a clever way against African Americans, Hispanics, Asian immigrants, and Red Indians, that is the Native Americans, whom they considered undesirable or unfit for that matter. In reality, there was hardly any difference between the American and Nazi eugenics program. What Nazis did in a crude, cruel manner, Americans did that in a shrewd and subtle way. Gas chambers and compulsory sterilization were replaced by cleverly done euthanasia and selective sterilization programs using doctors, hospitals, and medications. I would like to request all of you to go through Google and search for American Eugenics Society, or for that matter Planned Parenthood program, or for that matter Ernst Rudin and the role they played in depopulation.
A fascination that very, very powerful and very bad people like the Rockefellers had since they became the world's wealthiest people, a fascination with something called eugenics. How many of you are familiar with what eugenics is all about? Well, for those of you who aren't, eugenics is so-called race-breeding science. You have a superior race like the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds, as they see it, not as I see it, but as they see it. And then you have the unwanted, the human cancer, as one of their people called it. The human cancer that spreads, reproduces. So, after the end of World War II, the Rockefellers became one of the largest financial patrons of something called the American Eugenics Society. And a very, very close family friend of the Rockefeller family, Margaret Sanger, created the Planned Parenthood Federation, which was nothing but a disguised form of eugenics. And during the 30s, she went into Harlem, which is a black ghetto in New York City, and created something called the Negro Project. She wrote in a letter to a friend that somehow leaked into the public domain, fortunately. She said, "If the black ministers ever get wind of the fact that the Negro Project is about reducing the black population, or the Negro population as it was called then, then our project is in real trouble." That was eugenics.
During the World War II, atrocities and cruelty committed by the Nazi regime exposed the eugenics and depopulation agenda of the West. Hence, the word eugenics became a taboo. As a result, the ruling elite started to use different terminologies such as population control and reproductive health in order to continue their real agenda, or for that matter, their hidden agenda. John D. Rockefeller III, the grandson of John D. Rockefeller Sr., set up an organization called Population Council with an aim to reduce the population of resource-rich second and third world countries, particularly India. Naturally, question comes, what was their motive? Cold War was hotting up during 1960s and 1970s, and the West needed resources. Second and third world countries are extremely resource rich. A large population in these countries would end up utilizing a large chunk of their own resources. Ruling elites wanted to reserve a fair share of these resources for their industrialist Western world, whom they refer to as developed nations. And this was the need of the hour during the Cold War, because the West wanted to disintegrate Soviet Russia at all cost. John D. Rockefeller III set up this Population Council with this very motive. In order to make population control part of US government policy, Rockefellers drafted in Henry Kissinger, a German Jew, who fled Germany right before the start of the Second World War. He was a former American Secretary of State and former National Security Advisor under Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford administration. A study was conducted under the leadership of this Henry Kissinger called National Security Study Memorandum 200 or NSSM 200, Implications of Worldwide Population Growth for US Security and Overseas Interests. Finally, on the basis of this report, Population Control Agenda was adopted as official US government policy under US President Gerald Ford in 1975. It was later declassified in 1990 once the Cold War was over. Kindly read through this particular Wikipedia page, which talks about National Security Study Memorandum 200. Kindly listen to William Engdahl, what he had to say in this regard.
And in the 50s, John D. Rockefeller III, who specialized in Asia and in population reduction, the four brothers divided the world up among them after the war. Well, John D. Rockefeller III created something called the Population Council. The purpose of the Population Council was to reduce population. They hired demographers at elite universities like Princeton to come up with scary numbers that would terrify the population about how Indian people are reproducing like rabbits and there's famine because there are too many people in India and so forth. Africa, they did the same thing, China. So that most of the world came to believe, especially in the industrial world, came to believe that the greatest danger on Earth today is overpopulation. Well, don't worry, because the Rockefellers, through their Population Council, began funding all sorts of research in birth control devices, intrauterine devices, and so forth. They were a little bit sad that their money didn't finance the creation of the birth control pill in the 60s, but they did everything to promulgate it and support it once it was discovered. And John D. Rockefeller III turned to a protege of the Rockefeller family in the early 1970s, who was then the National Security Advisor to the President Nixon, by the name of Henry Kissinger. Perhaps some of you have heard of this gentleman. And Kissinger was commissioned to do a top secret study called NSSM 200. It later in the 1990s, this was in 1974, in the 1990s it was finally declassified from top secrecy and people could read what was in there. But it became, on the signature of President Gerald Ford, it became official U.S. government policy for the first time to impose population reduction on what Kissinger called developing countries where they have rapid population growth and rich raw material resources that the West needs to fight the Cold War, oil, metals, rare earth metals, whatever. So Kissinger argued that these rapid population increases will create population that will demand of their governments that they get a share of the pie, that they have an economic development. Well, what an obscene thing for populations to demand economic development, a good standard of living, adequate food, shelter, and so forth. We can't allow that to happen, so we have to reduce populations.